you ever wondered if Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy stayed true to the books? After all, the films won a combined 17 Oscars and are world-renowned as some of the greatest cinematic works of all time. So it must have taken Tolkien's already famous writings and just copied it over to a screenplay, right? Well, not exactly. Peter Jackson made a lot of cuts and alterations to the Lord of the Rings trilogy in order to adapt it to fit the silver screen. Things like Tom Bombadil and the Old Forest were completely removed from the films, and other moments like Frodo's flight to the Ford were just altered to better fit the film narrative. But today, we begin to uncover some of the scenes that Jackson and his team added to the Fellowship of the Ring that Tolkien never wrote about. You know this scene? And this one? And this one and this one? Well, they never actually happened. Some of these are minor changes, and others are major thematic differences that alter the future of the entire trilogy. And for every addition, there must be a subtraction. For example, we miss an entire song that Bilbo sings in the Hall of Fire in Rivendell. Oh, you don't know what the Hall of Fire is? Well, that's because it's left out of the movies too. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 9 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the show where I analyze Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings scene by scene and compare it to Tolkien's original work. If you're just now tuning in, make sure to go back and watch the previous episodes to get caught up with where we are today. This series is for those of us who want to dive deeper into the lore of Middle-earth that we miss when we only watch the films. Today we're covering 3 scenes that precede the Council of Elrond, as the Council of Elrond itself contains quite a few changes, and therefore I'll be leaving it for next week's episode. Today we have a lot to cover as Jackson and his team have begun to spin their own narratives into the story, and we have the culmination of many different loose ends all getting tied together, and some new loose ends being created as well. Let's start things off by giving a brief refresher on what happens in these scenes of the movie, and then I'll cover our 4 categories of possible deviations, which are characters, timeline, location, and plot. Starting with Frodo waking up in Rivendell, Gandalf is at his side and Frodo asks where he was and why he didn't meet them in Bree. We then see a flashback of Gandalf escaping Isengard, but he doesn't tell this to Frodo. Sam comes into the room and is ecstatic that Frodo is alive and well, and Elrond welcomes Frodo to Rivendell. Afterwards, Frodo leaves his room and meets up with Merry and Pippin, and then sees Bilbo. Bilbo shows Frodo his book, which is now finished, and he explains some of what he's been doing all of these years. Frodo then walks outside and encounters Sam packing up his belongings, and Sam says he's ready to head back home as they have finished what they set out to do. We then cut to Elrond and Gandalf discussing the ring and the fate of Middle-earth. Elrond strongly hints that Frodo shows incredible resistance to the ring, but Gandalf says that he has contributed enough to this journey. Elrond and Gandalf then continue to discuss the growing darkness, and Elrond recounts the story of Isildur taking the ring on the slopes of Mount Doom. He says that the bloodline of men has grown weak, yet Gandalf points out that there is one who still could take up the charge. Elrond says that he has forsaken that path long ago though, and chosen exile. And we cut to Aragorn. He is reading a book in the halls of Rivendell, and Boromir, who just arrived that day, walks into the hall. They exchange some words, and then Boromir handles an ancient relic like a child and cuts himself, and he runs off, and then Arwen approaches Aragorn. They discuss his reluctance to follow in the footsteps of his forefathers, and then they begin discussing their own relationship, and Arwen pledges herself to Aragorn and says she gives up an immortal life for him. Then it cuts to the next day, which is the Council of Elrond. Again, there are a lot of things to discuss in that scene alone, so I will save that for next week. For now, let's dive into all of the changes and additions that we already have in just these 3 scenes. To start, let's talk about characters. The characters we see in these scenes are Isildur, Gandalf, the 4 hobbits and Bilbo, Elrond, Legolas, Boromir, Gimli, Arwen, and Aragorn. The characters that Tolkien writes about but we don't see are Glorfindel, Gloin, and Lindir. Some might say that we see Gloin, but he doesn't do any talking in the movie. We have already met Glorfindel, but we learn more in this section about the identity of this seemingly overpowered elf. Gandalf tells Frodo that Glorfindel is one of the mighty of the Firstborn, an elf lord of a house of princes. I don't have time to do a deep dive on him today, but comment below if you would be interested in a video all about the life and history of Glorfindel. Also, Gloin is essentially a main character in this chapter and the chapter of the Council of Elrond. In fact, Gimli, Gloin's son, doesn't speak at all in these sections, which is the opposite to the movie. I think Tolkien wrote this as if people would have read The Hobbit already and therefore be familiar with Gloin as one of the company who traveled with Bilbo. Gimli would have been totally new, so using Gloin to bridge the narrative gap makes for a smoother transition. Lindir is simply an elf of Rivendell who has some speaking parts, but for the most part is just a normal elf. Next, we have our 2 categories of timeline and location. As for timeline, there's really not much of a difference. It's kind of hard to explain this because a lot of these scenes are added and not discussed in the book, but for the most part they got it right. Frodo wakes up on the 24th of October, he goes back to sleep, and then he wakes up again for a feast, which we'll discuss in a little bit, and then after going back to sleep for that night, he wakes up to the morning of the 25th of October for the Council of Elrond. Pretty much the timeline's all the same, but like I said, some of these scenes make it look a little wonky. As for location, everything takes place in Rivendell, but if we're being nitpicky, Jackson left out the time in the Hall of Fire, which is a room in Rivendell that has a fire that burns 24/7. It's a place of rest and merriment for the inhabitants who can come and sing songs or relax by the fire whenever they would like. So after the feast, everyone goes to the Hall of Fire for an after party pretty much, which is omitted from the film. Again, the writers would probably argue that it did happen, but they just didn't show it. Instead, we got scenes like this.
Still showing.
Like I said, for every addition, there must be a subtraction. So now that we've covered characters, timeline, and location, we need to go over the final category of plot differences, which I know is everyone's favorite. Hang tight, as today is a roller coaster of scenes that never happened in the book, so I'll do my best to explain the differences while also giving you a feel of what Tolkien actually writes. Kind of like the video I did on Tom Bombadil, this might be more of a summary of the book than an analysis of the scenes, as it is impossible to point out some differences without giving you context for what Tolkien says actually happens. But if you're curious about the character assassination of Boromir, Aragorn's true love story with Arwen, and more, then stick through it because there are so many juicy details to cover. So here we go. Starting with when Frodo wakes up in Rivendell, there are already a few changes. First, Gandalf and Frodo talk for quite a while in his room. Something to remember is that in the movie, we have the privilege of seeing multiple stories as the film cuts between different plot lines. Whereas in the book, Tolkien writes from the perspective of the hobbits, and therefore this time in Rivendell is when Tolkien recaps everything that has happened outside of their periphery. We already know what happened between Saruman and Gandalf because we saw it early in the movie, but in the book, Frodo is just now learning about it. So the first change is that Gandalf actually does share this information with Frodo, whereas in the movie, he keeps it to himself after a brief flashback. Real quick, there is one change in the flashback, which is that Gwaihir rescues Gandalf unbeknownst to Saruman. In the movie flashback, Saruman is bullying Gandalf on top of Orthanc when he gets rescued. In the book, after Gandalf recounts all of his doings to Frodo, Frodo falls back asleep. Next, because I'm going to do this in chronological order of the scenes, I need to cover this, but there is a bit of an asterisk next to this change. So after Frodo sees Bilbo in Rivendell, we get a scene of them briefly talking and Bilbo shows him his book. Bilbo is very old looking now and says that he would like to travel, but he never got the chance. This is contrary to the book, as Tolkien says that Bilbo hasn't aged as much visually, and Bilbo even tells Frodo that he did travel with the dwarves back to visit Dale and Dain in Erebor. The asterisk attached to this change is that this does not happen yet in the book, because Frodo doesn't get to meet Bilbo until after the feast, which we'll address here in a second. Next, there is no moment of Sam packing up his belongings and telling Frodo that he's ready to go back to the Shire. In fact, Sam quite likes Rivendell and is excited to show Frodo around. After this moment in the movie, it pans to Gandalf and Elrond talking. While I'm sure they had plenty of talks behind the scenes in the books, this moment isn't explicitly written about by Tolkien. In fact, the story Elrond tells of him and Isildur at Mount Doom is technically recounted during the Council of Elrond in the book. Additionally, Elrond is not nearly as critical of men in the book as he is in the movie. Also, he says that Aragorn has chosen exile, which isn't true, as Aragorn in the book is ready to take up the mantle of king just at the right time. He is not scared of his heritage like they portray in the films, and he even carries around the shards of Narsil with him at all times. We'll talk about that more in a moment, but first we have to discuss something that is left out of the movie entirely, which is the feast. That night they have a feast in honor of Frodo, and this is where we meet Gloin. Gloin sits next to Frodo at the feast, and they talk for quite a while, as Frodo is keen to hear all about the dwarves. Gloin tells him all about his land and people and shares updates on all the members of Thorin's company, as that would have been a tale Frodo was very familiar with. Gloin mentions that Balin, Ori, and Oin all went to reclaim Moria 30 years prior, and while at first things were all good, they have not received word from them for a long time. This is actually what brings Gloin to seek the Council of Elrond, because they want advice and wisdom on the matter, which by the way, this is a common theme we'll discuss more next week. The Council of Elrond isn't so much Elrond summoning all the peoples of Middle-earth to Rivendell, as much as it is the peoples coming to seek his advice on specific issues they have, and it just so happens that all of their issues relate to the One Ring. Anyway, after the feast, everyone heads to the Hall of Fire. As I mentioned previously, this is kind of the after party, and this is also where Frodo gets to meet Bilbo. Frodo is overjoyed to see his uncle again, and Bilbo tells him that he has been writing a song but is struggling to finish it, and then he recruits Aragorn's help to do so. Frodo sits down and nearly falls asleep when he suddenly wakes up to hear Bilbo singing a song with with a group of elves gathered around him. After he finishes, Bilbo asks the elves if they can tell which lines were his and which ones were Aragorn. One of the elves, named Lindir, says that he cannot tell the difference between mortals writing, and then Bilbo admits that he pretty much wrote the whole thing anyway. After this, Bilbo and Frodo get back together and start walking out of the Hall of Fire to find a place more private to chat. While they're leaving, Frodo sees Arwen standing with Aragorn, and he is immediately entranced. Bilbo and him finally leave, and then they talk some more in his room before going to bed. By the way, earlier in the night after Frodo first meets Bilbo again, that's where we get the jump scare scene, as at this time, Bilbo asks to see the ring and Frodo sees a vision like what we see in the movie. I know technically this doesn't happen in the movie until after the Council of Elrond, but I just wanted to mention it since it happens in this chapter of the book. The only difference is that Bilbo never lunges at him like in the movie. In the book, it is completely a figment of Frodo's own imagination and mind. Still though, Bilbo realizes what Frodo is going through and is very apologetic that the ring ever had to be passed down to him. So now that we've discussed the feast and the after party in the Hall of Fire, let's talk about some of these additional moments in the movie. First, the movie cuts to Aragorn reading in a hall of Rivendell after Elrond says that he's chosen a path of exile, which I already said isn't true. While he's reading, Boromir approaches and they greet each other. So right off the bat, this is never written about in the books. Second, even if it did happen, this is the start of Jackson's character assassination of Boromir. Boromir would have never acted this way, specifically in regards to handling the shards of Narsil. We already know that in the books, the shards are safely kept with Aragorn, but in the movie, they're on display in Rivendell. However, even if they were on display and Boromir did see them, he, as a nobleman of Gondor in high status, would never have been so flippant about picking it up and touching the tip. In fact, the shards of Narsil would have been a legend to someone from Gondor. He probably would have been too respectful to even touch it. But even if they were at Rivendell, and even if he did pick it up and cut himself on it, he would have never just clumsily put it on a pedestal and let it fall. It's just like this domino effect of bad behavior that is contrary to his character in the books. Yes, they are setting up his character for a future betrayal of Frodo, but in the books, he's still a respectable man of Gondor at this point and has yet to be corrupted by the ring. And this is a fact, as at this point, Boromir has no idea that the ring even exists, or that it could even be in the same place as him, as according to his people, the ring is practically a myth. It is only the next day at the Council of Elrond that everyone learns about the One Ring's existence. At this point, the only people who know about it in the book are Elrond, the hobbits, Gandalf, and Aragorn. The other people at the council don't know about it yet. We'll get to discuss the character assassination of Boromir more in next week's episode about the council itself. Next, after Boromir leaves to find a band-aid, Arwen comes up to Aragorn, who is placing the sword back on its stand. They discuss Aragorn's heritage, and he says that he is afraid of the blood that flows in his veins, as it's the same blood of Isildur, who had a chance to destroy the ring, but didn't. Then we cut to the couple standing in some garden, talking about their relationship, and while Aragorn tries to push Arwen away, Arwen is adamant that she will give up her immortal life to be with Aragorn. Okay, so let's pause here. First, as far as I know, the only time we see Arwen in the entirety of the Fellowship of the Ring book is in the Hall of Fire when Frodo sees her. Of course, it is possible that her and Aragorn had some alone time outside of this, but we never hear about it, and therefore the scene isn't completely canon. A hint as to why this probably didn't happen is because we hear more about Arwen and Aragorn's relationship in the appendices. For example, we learn there that Arwen tells Aragorn she will marry him once he becomes king. Also, we learn that she is rarely seen by mortal men, which the movie contradicts as she is seen multiple times. Lastly, Aragorn never tries to push her away in the book. In the book, he is set on his purpose in life to become king and fight against Sauron, and he is fully on board with this only getting married once he becomes king thing. In the movie, he tries pushing Arwen away, and he is afraid of his destiny. So to recap, Arwen is only seen once in the whole book, Aragorn and her have a healthy relationship, and Aragorn is fully on board with fulfilling his destiny. We'll talk about Arwen and Elrond's father-daughter issues next week most likely, so I won't get into that today. I just want to point out again for all the people furiously typing in the comments right now that I love the movies. And honestly, there isn't much that I would change in them, but I think it is super fun to go through the books and see all of the detail and lore that Tolkien has to offer. I highly encourage embarking on this journey with me as I go through the series. Who knows, you might uncover something you never knew about, and maybe you'll end up liking the books more than the movie. I know for some that reading the books can be biting off a little more than they can chew, so that's why I always recommend Audible. If you want to get your first audiobook free, go ahead and click my link in the description to claim your free trial and free audiobook, which also helps support the channel. So what do you think about these these changes. I'd love to hear in the comments how you think these moments impact the overall story. I feel that things like Aragorn's love story with Arwen, as well as his relationship with his own destiny, are heavily affected by some of these early additions in the movie. As always, comment below if you noticed anything that I missed, and make sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date each week as I continue this series. Have a great week, and see you in the next episode.